Okay, I've got the privilege of introducing our last speaker. Having walked a mile or two in his shoes, I can tell you that what he's looking at is he's been gone most of the afternoon traveling up here. He's going to speak with us, for which is an awesome opportunity, and then he's going to go back to work and get home about 9 o'clock tonight. Coordinating our nation's cybersecurity policy today is certainly a full-time job and demands a leader with good policy background and a very technical understanding of what's going on. Rob Joyce fills both those bills on both counts. Most important for this audience, Rob's a veteran of the great philosophical leadership of a director who said, "One team, one mission." And so Rob has spent time both in offense and defense. I prefer to think in terms of soccer than football, but either way, he's got the kind of background that the nation needs. He's got a lot on his plate. And you know what those challenges are as you watch the news. A couple of the most significant are the new executive order for cybersecurity and the separation of the National Security Agency from Cybersecurity Command. Rob, we know you're busy. We appreciate the fact that you drove up here to join us tonight. Thanks for all that, and thanks for being here. The floor is yours.
Thanks, General. Yeah, and I have been the beneficiary of a great line of leaders at NSA, both the folks we've had as directors, deputy directors, and some exceptional mentors along the way. So in keeping with the theme of the day today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where I'm shaped in thinking about the future. We'll talk about some of today's challenges. And then we'll talk about what we're doing from the White House perspective with the interagency to try to address some of those things. And I think I'll cut to a piece of the chase, which is where the last panel ended, which is, boy, there's a lot of differing opinions about the right way ahead, right? And so that's a lot of what we're involved in, is coordinating those policies and bringing together those smart people. Because that's the incredible thing about cyber today, is you can get a whole bunch of people in the room who are going like this, right? Pointing in different directions on the same question. And both of them are very, very smart people. They're well informed, and they're building off a really good base of justification for that answer. So we still are working to drive forward and understand where we need to be. So for me, the framing question about looking about where we need to be is trying to project that future, which you've been talking about all day. I would ask you to play a thought experiment with me for a minute and just rewind 10 years in your life, right? 10 years ago today, the iPhone had just been introduced. So 10 years ago, none of us carried the internet around in our pocket, right? We didn't have a camera with us every waking moment, a video camera with us. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have connectivity to the cloud. We didn't have the ability to change our thermostat at home or check video security monitors. We didn't have this ability to leverage that big data that lives back in these massive databases, constantly churning and updating with new information. That's the power we can access. The sum total of the human knowledge of our whole civilization is available to me anytime, anywhere, right? And combined with the physical sensors on that device, it can now tell me all sorts of things about the world, right? My kids are never going to know what it's like to be lost in a car these days unless they let their battery run out and their charging cord is broken in the car, right? That is a whole different way than most of us in this room grew up. So if you think about that and say 10 years ago the iPhone didn't exist, and watch how much our society has changed to rely on that small device, boy, I'm humbled at trying to say, where should we be in 10 years from today, right? Boy, if I could have predicted the amazing, it wasn't the first smartphone, but it certainly set the bar and wound up changing. If you look back at what existed pre-10 years ago and what we're using today, it's much more built on that foundation than anything else. So I set that as the framework to say, now let's expand that to the things we as a society need to do, things your government needs to be involved in, the policies, the regulations, the laws that we need to drive. And a lot of us in here grew up in a DoD-centric background, right? And what's the future of cyber warfare? And what's that mean? So the challenge for all of us is multidimensional. We've got to worry about that incredible economic benefit that cyber and the cyber technologies have brought us. There is no denying that the innovation the U.S. led in Silicon Valley, the concepts we've driven to put things online and make things more efficient, more capable, have benefited all of us. It's benefited us personally, it's benefited us in our businesses and in our government, but it also just systemically as a society has benefited us. We're also looking at what has that change brought about. You heard some stats in the last panel about the social ills that it can bring. It's also brought the capability of massive cyber crime, right? The Willie Sutton example of why does Willie Sutton rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. So why are the cyber criminals going after us online? That's where the money is. America stores its intellectual technology, its intellectual property. It stores the representation of money out in bits, and we continue to invest in that way, and so we've got to figure out how to secure it. At the same time now we've got the wave of Internet of Things, where we're not only connecting our digital components in there, we've got this large amount of physical devices being connected up to the internet. We've seen the downside of that. We saw the Mirai botnet last year, where poorly designed, poorly secured devices all attached to the internet were exploited and then turned back on components of the internet to knock down large swaths of that internet, making it unavailable for the rest of us to use. So that in and of itself points out that as we make these changes, as we adopt things, we're going to find that the rate of change and adoption has exceeded our ability to secure these devices we've taken on. So what does that mean? It means a whole lot of self-reflection and introspection on the part of government leaders, on the part of our legislative branch, on the part of the think tanks and the academics who are represented here. It's also, a big part in the commercial industry, trying to find out where is the opportunity to make money or to create the next big thing that is going to drive the industry to improvements. So that's the challenge we face. So I get the chance to come into the White House every day, think about cyber policy, work with some amazing thinkers, both inside and outside government, to look at these. So where did we start this year? We started with President Trump signing an executive order, and that had 4 big aspects in it. The first aspect of that executive order was focused on government technology. If you think about what the government runs on, we run on data, we run on connectivity, we run on information flow between citizens and the government. And with all of that, if you think about efficient technology and high-end technology, the first place you think about is often not the government. I would also submit to you, if you've studied any amount of cybersecurity, you'll almost always find that older technology has known inherent flaws, right? There are bugs, and the older technology you're running, the more likely it is that somebody's already discovered that flaw and has been able to talk about it, research it, publish it, provide an exploit, or provide something that can compromise it. So when you put those together, what it says is, chances are some of the government technology we're running is putting us at risk. So Section 1 of the executive order was really focused on the way the government does technology. And it says we're going to improve and modernize the federal architecture. We're going to leverage a few things in that space. We're going to look at cloud services and modern shared services. Why? Because when you do things at scale, you're able to leverage you're better able to leverage knowledge and efficiencies to secure and defend it. If you think about a small mail server that a company may run themselves, if they self-host that on a server, the chances of them paying attention to it 24/7, keeping it updated, patched, but really defending it, thinking about the logs, that's a tall order for a company whose main job is not doing that. When you think about one of the major cloud email providers, chances are they have tens or hundreds of people who are thinking about that every day, right? They're able to also, at that scale, understand things in that data about massive phishing campaigns or massive criminal malware releases that at scale are pretty apparent, but to any one small individual email domain is probably not apparent. So by leveraging and moving to these large-scale economies of scale, we actually get better security. You also think about the people who can do this type of security. So across more than 100 departments and agencies in the federal government, there are some that are incredibly able to attract and recruit talent. There are others where the graduates of big tech schools, if you're coming out of a Carnegie Mellon, an MIT, a Stanford, you're probably not going to go to the Bureau of Reclamation, right? But at the same time, the Bureau of Reclamation is running real hydroelectric dams, power generation, and physical devices that need to be secured and need to be protected, right? So how do we as a government start to address that? We're going to have places in government where we create that center of excellence, critical mass, much like a big email provider is able to bring hundreds of people to securing that one thing. We're going to have hundreds of people together who are thinking about securing the government's IoT, the government's SCADA system, the government's email systems, and we'll use the best in breeds in those. We're also going to have a mindset shift. Today, a lot of the departments and agencies think about their mission in terms of the jobs assigned to the department and agency. But when I meet with the heads of the major banking institutions in the U.S., it turns out they will spend many days a quarter worrying about cybersecurity personally as the head of that company. Why? Because it's an existential threat to their business existence, right? So how do we get departments and agency heads thinking about cybersecurity, the safety of their data, the ability to protect and improve those services they provide as a major business component of their activity day to day? It's got to be a mindset shift that they take it on and they own it the same way private industry is. So that was Pillar 1, the products and services in the cyber arena for the federal government. Pillar 2 is the critical infrastructure of the U.S. If you look at the critical infrastructure, more than 70% of the critical infrastructure in the U.S. is provided by corporations. It's not done by government agencies. So in that, it says we've got to have some sort of tight partnership between the public and private components of the U.S. If you think about the energy sector, the lights in this room, the ability to power the pumps that run gasoline, run the gas service stations, the electricity that is driving the communications infrastructure, the backbone that lets the bits flow from here to there, the electricity that underpins the banking industry, they're all nested together, right? At the base of that pyramid, we often find the power segment as a critical infrastructure entity. We've got to think about how do we protect critical infrastructure in the U.S. in a way that's both responsive to the growing threat, but also resilient to the known the attacks we know are coming. So earlier in the panel today, there were some comments that we need to focus on resiliency. I think inside our policy discussions, we're focused there too. The expectation that you can build this moat, this castle, with a big wall and keep everybody out is long past. The focus for critical infrastructure for us really is resiliency, and that's a few different elements. Resiliency means the ability to withstand those challenges, but also the ability to segment when you do have a compromise, that failure to a small and manageable segment of that critical infrastructure. And then finally, segmenting so when you do have a failure, you can restore in a reasonable amount of time. There's a concept of deterrence, which includes deterrence by denial. And one of the things we have to make sure of in our government systems and in our critical infrastructure, that the adversaries can't assume they'll have success. If you introduce the element of doubt, whether they'll achieve their objective, whether it's a military objective, an intelligence objective, or some economic objective, if there's elements of doubt and then there's a cost to executing that, you're going to deter. So our focus in some of this space, especially critical infrastructure, is to include an element of deterrence by denial. Additionally, in the critical infrastructure sector, as we talked about resilience, we've got to demonstrate that ability to have resilience, and that'll be focused through exercises. We've got to play like we practice. In the past, a lot of our exercises have focused on critical infrastructure. We run a national power grid exercise that focuses on a cyber attack, GridX. This year's GridX is going to include not only the power industry, but it's going to include, excuse me, it's going to include the communications segment and the banking industry, with an assumption that as we have a major outage in the electrical sector, that it will impact and cascade into those other areas, causing challenges for them. And what we're trying to do is show the resilience in those other two sectors as they are challenged by a failure in the power sector. So looking at critical infrastructure going forward, one of the big questions we have is, what does the government provide to critical infrastructure that is unique and beneficial? The easiest and shortest answer is information, right? The answer for years has been information sharing. We've been challenged at times because often the government's understanding of critical infrastructure, threats against critical infrastructure is classified. So in that space, big focus is effective clearances, but also moving people inside the membrane so that they're closer to the information the government has, rather than the government pushing everything out, where we're challenged getting sensitive sources and methods out to the other end. You'll see more as we focus on the information sharing component, the clearance component. A good example of that is the declaration of election infrastructure as critical infrastructures by DHS this year. The ability that then gives the federal government to provide support and aid to state and local entities in elections. But you'll also see that a clearance effort is underway right now, making sure that the head state election official in every state is cleared, and that the state's attorney general is also cleared, so that we get the maximum chance to produce and push down threat information that the federal government knows, so that we can understand in advance of the election where the threats are emanating. So pillar 1, federal government; pillar 2, critical infrastructure; 3 is looking forward. We have to we have to understand, trying to figure out a better way to start. So federal government, critical infrastructure, and then we've got a base layer of the education and workforce development. If you underpin everything the government needs to do, everything private industry needs to do, it starts with the people. I grew up at NSA, and there's been a long set of leaders who have talked about the power of the people there as the secret ingredient we have in government. The idea that the computers can be replaced, the computers will be upgraded, the technology will come and go, but in the end, the people of the government, the people of industry are the ones who innovate. Today, we've got about 300,000 jobs short, a 300,000 job shortfall in cybersecurity. So for the college students in the audience today who are studying cybersecurity, you're at the right place at the right time. There is a huge appetite for skilled professionals out there. That gap between the available population and the needs is growing larger and larger every year, and in fact, the delta is growing at an exponential rate, which is unsustainable. So that's the research challenge for those of you who are looking to go on to continue in academia and not enter commercial entities, is how do we turn technology, big data, and other capabilities to doing a bit of those jobs so that we don't have to keep increasing exponentially with people, that we can get on with the securing of our infrastructure and capabilities, using the smart humans for smart things that only humans can do, and then automating the low-level stuff that brings problems to the attention of humans. So big focus in that area. That for us starts at the lowest level of education. You've seen the White House push some STEM education recently. It starts with especially working some of the diversity issues we have in cybersecurity. If you look, it's a heavily white male-dominated endeavor. There are sharp minorities, women, who can be, should be involved in these activities. And so we're trying to balance that going forward and develop others in that. And then at the high end, there are things like Scholarship for Service, which are just outstanding programs that not only bring people to education, help them pay for their education, but bring people into the government for a small obligation of service time. And then when you come out the other end, you've got a chance to have tried government. A lot actually find that they love it, they stay, and some then come out with great experiences, great connections to government, and get back into private industry. So we're very focused on the development of workforce and the things we need to do to improve the technologies here in the U.S. So that brings me around to the last pillar of our activity, which is international collaboration and deterrence. If you focus on where we are in cybersecurity, you can argue that cyberspace brings all of our neighbors inside the fence line, right? The distance between those who would do us harm, those who would steal our money, has little to do with proximity. We've enjoyed for generations here in the U.S. the luxury of having oceans keep us apart from some of the nation states who would do us harm. We've also, in general, enjoyed the population diversity across the U.S. where most of us didn't live in bad neighborhoods, right? The criminals didn't live near you, and your proximity to those who would steal your things, break into your homes. There was the option of even moving away from that if you felt threatened. Today on the internet, it doesn't feel like that, right? The ability for criminals in Eastern Europe, for those in Asia, to reach directly out and to launch malware campaigns, to do ransomware against us here in the US. There's no physical insurance to protect us between that delta. The criminals live and walk amongst us in our cyber identities. So we've got to think about what that means in terms of our ability to drive down the risks in this space. So for us, one of the roles government can play is we can build those coalitions and friends and allies. We've reached out. We've got several like-minded countries. We'll continue to build those. And one of the things we do with other like-minded countries is we do deterrence. In terms of the way we look at this, we've spent several years building up some really important norms. We've built up agreements that international law applies in cyberspace. The idea that theft of intellectual property for commercial gain is not something that should be tolerated in cyberspace. Right? These ideas are generally agreed to. The issue now is not that we don't have the norms, it's that what are the costs that encourage people to live within those norms? And what we found is big multinational groups don't do norms very well, right? They don't enforce those norms with any teeth. So we're trying to find ways to push the deterrence with other like-minded countries where we can pair up in terms of bilateral relationship and not move at the slowest element of an international group. The UN's a great example, right? Getting the entities of the UN to agree on a consensus issue, very hard. Even the Security Council fractured most of the time. If you look at NATO, which is a fairly like-minded group, there's divergence there. So if you need all of the elements of an international group to decide we all agree on the attribution of a cyber event, we all agree on the way forward to push back on a cyber event, that's really hard to achieve. So what we're advocating, what we're pushing are these bilateral relationships where the U.S. and another partner who's been wronged or another partner who sees the bad behavior on the internet the same way can reach out and start to drive up those costs. Because in the end, that's what it's about, is the cost benefit for behaving poorly on the internet is out of whack today. And we have to find a way to realign that cost benefit ratio. The idea that you can do ransomware across the globe is enabled because we haven't been able to pursue those criminals, and we haven't made the downside for that activity outweigh what they're finding in financial benefit. So at that level, at the nation-state level, we've got to have an array of tools to include diplomatic tools, to include law enforcement, judicial tools. We've got to have the ability to do cyber back towards cyber in terms of deterrence, but recognizing that cyber rarely deters cyber on its own. It's got to be part of a much larger portfolio. The U.S. has done sanctions as a very powerful tool in our nation-state tradecraft, and a host of other things. But in the end, it's going to be a portfolio of cost imposition with partners that are going to start to enforce some of these norms. Because today, by any measure you want to use, the cyber threats are going in the wrong direction today. So as we wrestle with those things, we often have to focus on where do we go from here. So the executive order I talked about gave some direction, especially on the government side, but for the most part, the call to arms in that executive order was to tap the power of the departments and agencies to produce some reports, to think about those problems of deterrence, to think about those problems of the Internet of Things issues, to think about international partnerships, and to provide reports to the president. Most of those reports are either done or in draft today, in review today. And so they are informing the next step, which is national cyber policy and the execution of those policies to drive the change we need to continue to turn this. right? I think, the speakers here today were pretty eloquent talking about how hard we've worked this problem with some incredible minds and some incredible effort. I don't expect when I step out of my job that we're going to wipe our hands and say, we're all done. Thanks for all of your help fixing this cyber thing. But what we all ought to be able to do is leave it a little better than we found it, and that's our strong hope going forward. So I will stop here and open the floor to questions, because I've heard there's been a great interaction across today, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Is there a way to lower this little? Oh, there we go. Hi, sir. Thank you for coming today.
Happy to.
My name is Kelly Lebenger. I am an assistant researcher to Professor Ivan Aragon-Toft, who spoke before on the Futures panel. And I also work for Philip Niedermeyer, who's the Director of Strategic Alliances for Whiteford Taylor Preston, who's helping to build out the private-public sector partnership on cybersecurity. So if you will allow me to provide a little context for my question. So today we have a stunning and terrifying national security problem related to cyber. The components include the failure and disorganization of the legislature, yawning capability gaps, the Budget Control Act of 2015, no national cyber curriculum, national ignorance of cyber threat, our adversaries undermining our commerce, democratic integrity, stealing and buying out our IP, sending spies into our graduate-level education programs, our lack of response to the Sesame social credit, and the list goes on. But there are solutions. I've heard some here. I've heard them at the JSA hosted by the Army Cyber Institute. I've heard them at Cyber Beacon hosted by National Defense University. I've actually taken thorough notes, and I've written down what those solutions are and who supplied them. But what I haven't seen is them applied. So here we are. We cannot count on the legislative branch to fix this. That's clear. I guess that leaves the executive. So my question is, who specifically at the highest level is the leader in charge of aggressively strategizing and pursuing the fix?
So I think if you're talking at the White House, that's me, right? So I am the person at the White House who any given day has the luxury of thinking about cyber from the time I arrive to the time I go home. There are others, Tom Bossert has the Homeland Security portfolio. He has cyber, but he also has counterterrorism. It's been a busy month for hurricanes, terrorism, and other topics, so he has those. And then National Security Advisor similarly, and certainly the President and Vice President. So at the White House, I am the Cybersecurity Coordinator. But what that title means is I have the power of the interagency, right? So I don't have directive authority. I have the ability to pull together departments and agencies, all of whom have some sort of slice in this. I think that's reflected by congressional activity as well. You talked about, I heard some frustration in the congressional way forward. That is, that's a symptom of the thing I talked about earlier, where smart people see this differently in different places. We have the luxury in the White House of pulling together departments and agencies, trying to coordinate policy for a consensus way forward. And if there's not a consensus, in the end, we get to tee up questions and options for the president to decide. So you can argue that the answer is two ways, right? One is me, cybersecurity coordinator, or the other is the president, because if in the end, two elements, two cabinet entities are going like this, and that's never happened in this community before, right? If they are at odds, in the end, it's the president in that space.
Is there a way that those of us who want to assist you in that mission, who might, be going to more conferences than you're able to go to, who have seen great solutions, can pass this along to you?
Certainly, yep. But I will tell you, the fun thing we have is, in the end, where you stand is where you sit. And I get very different answers about what the solution looks like from DHS, from DOD, from the Department of Commerce, and other departments and agencies. But see me afterwards. I'll give you my personal address.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thomas Rid, Johns Hopkins. You mentioned deterrence in detail. On the 13th of August last year, perhaps the most aggressive active measure that I can think of, shadow brokers started, directed against your former employer and probably your former unit. It got even ever more aggressive over the following year, leading up to NotPetya. What does that imply for deterrence, that they so far got away with it? The US government has not even acknowledged the operation as such. And how does that make you feel?
Yeah, so I will continue in that tradition of, the U.S. government's not going to acknowledge the shadow brokers component. I will say that, the comments on operations are not something I ought to be talking about at a podium from the White House. So, apologies.
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Shatrice Mosley, Cybersecurity Program Director for the state of Indiana. I kind of want to follow up on the first question that was asked that was well articulated, but you talked about it from a federal perspective on your role and the expectations by other agencies. From a state perspective, how do you see that interact at the federal government level, and what responsibilities the states should be taking in driving cybersecurity within their areas?
So there is a healthy amount of interaction between the states and the federal government. I'm sure from your position you see that. One thing I am challenged with is I think we need to ensure harmonization. One thing I get constantly, especially from our industry that works internationally, is they talk about regulation. They talk about their need to meet. So I'll take banks as an example. They will have multiple regulators, both federal and state. They will have international regulators. They will have multiple regulations at the various states. So while each of those creating laws based on their jurisdiction have the best interest in mind, what we find with our businesses is the compliance section of any given organization spends an abhorrent amount of time just trying to understand the various regulations across states, across multiple federal regulators, and then multiple international marketplaces. So we are working with a couple industry groups who are trying to characterize that for us and suggest way forward. What we found is good regulation is important. There's certainly places where lives are at risk, and that's the most important places. We've got to have some regulation. We've got some regulation in places where we've shown a need that the industry won't self-regulate, and to do the right things, it needs some regulation, whether it be one of those bodies. But the hardest part of that whole equation is when we get regulations that actually lock technology in at some unhelpful point in time. And you can look around at cyber and see that it often changes faster than the regulation and rulemaking bodies, to the point where we find cybersecurity is actually weakened either by competing regulations, where we've given the companies the ability to throw up their hands and say, look, they've told me left and right at the same time, I'm going to pick the one I like best. Or we've given them layer upon layer upon layer, and they have to invest significant resources doing something that's outdated and adding no value. So from my chair, I find a little bit less is more. I think it's really important that we have resources and focus on cybersecurity. But in terms of where the states can help is having resources and priorities at the state and local level that make sure that educational opportunities are happening, that the state's services are well defined and well resourced so that they can be modern and secure and protect our citizens' data. but then finally, that we don't over-regulate at multiple places at multiple times, so that some of the best may be nested referrals to big international standards or bigger regulatory bodies saying you must comply with this one place, so that when it gets modernized and updated, the local copy of that stays current. And I think those are some of the solutions out of the regulatory conflict we have. Thanks, good question.
Thank you for your time in advance. So you had mentioned centers of excellence, in particular places where there could be a critical mass of technological expertise around cyber, as well as workforce, so that maybe some of the lesser known or smaller agencies would be able to access that workforce and leverage it in a similar way that you can get a critical mass or scale with cloud type of solutions. Could you elaborate a bit further on what you think that center of excellence might look like, what agency it might be housed within, and if you have specific examples of existing centers or entities that you think could be expounded or expanded upon to satisfy what you envision in terms of a center of excellence?
Sure. So we're going to run a prototype this year. I think DHS is going to run it, where we're going to look at security operations centers, for example. Today, you'll often have SOCs, individual security operations centers, looking at individual networks. And that's a high-end, high-tech job that often are done well. But what we found is bigger data, better tools makes for more secure and more efficient SOCs. So we're going to look at outsourcing, the SOC service, not saying give up your network management, but bring your data to one composite place that has the most modern tools, the best big data analytics, some modern heuristics, and the ability then to aggregate data over space and time and say, look, these small 15 light touches that we never would have seen across 10 different networks, they're actually from the same place. It smells a little nefarious. We never would have noticed it at any one particular SOC, but aggregating those together, it breaks threshold and it's noticeable. So that's one example of the kind of place, and the ability to bring a security researcher out of a grad school to go and try new algorithms on that critical mass of data in the federal government is something that'll be attractive, where we're probably not going to get them to go to the Marine Mammal Commission to look at their small amount of data, right? So that's the kind of thing we're trying to push. Thanks. Yes?
Hi. First, I wanted to say thank you for coming out, taking time out of your busy day, although it wasn't a very far commute. I'm Jesse. I'm from UMUC. I actually am the coach of our cyber team for the college, and we actually meet in the server room in the basement downstairs. Cool. So anyway, I wanted to tell you that I took my son to Ocean City, and I gave him $2, and he came back with every prize in the machine. And I said to him, how'd you do that? He said, I hacked that. And I asked him, how did you learn how to hack that machine? And he said, I watched YouTube. Mm-hmm. So in the beginning of the day, we learned about these brilliant gentlemen that came up on stage that hacked all these things from, for NSA in 1997. Of course, I want my son to work at NSA later. But anyway, he said that, if kids that are 9 can do these types of things now, and, even myself, when they were doing that back then, they were special elite people. Now there are so many tools that your average novice can just download and perform the same kind of things. There's all this information, there's YouTube, there's videos. So it seems to me that the threat is way worse than it was back then. And I really just wanted to respond to how we should deal with that based on, coming back to where we started at the beginning of the day. And once again, all the speakers were great, and this was a great day.
Yep. Thanks. So good question. I would liken it to the security practices any institution, whether it's government, commercial, educational, needs to do. And that often starts with the fundamentals, right? The basic blocking and tackling. The idea that when there's a known vulnerability out there, that the manufacturer is being responsive to create the patch, and that we're taking advantage of that and retrofitting the patch. Or if one doesn't exist, we're thinking about other controls and other mitigations that can prevent that exploitation. So I would say that the Ocean City place wasn't doing good hygiene, right? There was a known problem out there. If you can find it on YouTube, that's a pretty well-known problem, and they ought to be thinking about defending against it. Now that is another example of, where are your priorities? They're probably losing very little in terms of the overall profitability there, that they can ignore it. There are places we're going to have networks that are probably less of a priority to defend and instrument and put our resources in. But there's also crown jewels that we can't give up and can't let be compromised. And those are the places where we got to make sure that, first off, we're doing those basic things, right? And you'd be amazed at how often, just, not to pick on them, but go back to the Equifax breach, right? That was a well-known vulnerability, and it came down to the processes in the company, it appears. That's at least the external technical assessment that led to the breach. So, how many times do we see that over and over again? At the individual level, there are, we talked about passwords here earlier. There's a great site that keeps track of other sites that have been compromised and aggregates the emails and the passwords used to access those sites. And they recently put out a database of millions of passwords that are known to have been compromised by hackers. And that means those passwords and emails are floating out there across the web, and it's well known now what that password breaks back to. So that data was given up free to the world to say, hey, you ought to check these passwords and not let somebody pick that password. If you're designing a system, start at the beginning and say, I'm going to check this password file, and if somebody put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it just says, sorry, try again, right? That probably doesn't matter much, on the website where you're posting kitten pictures. But it shouldn't be allowed at your banks, and it shouldn't be allowed on your work account, and it certainly shouldn't be allowed for any important governmental system access, right? So why don't we put in that basic blocking and tackling that says these are bad things? We're going to start at the beginning and design to not let that bad thing happen. So great question.
Hey, Rob. Jay Healy from Columbia University and Atlanta Council. I'm glad you mentioned Equifax, because you had some great quotes that we saw, I think, last week on Social Security numbers, and maybe it's time to replace them for certain uses, which would be wonderful. I'd love you to talk more about that, and if you see that the old NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, has potentially a role in that, because I don't think we'd heard that in the intervening week. Thank you.
Yeah, so for those of you that hadn't followed, I had a couple, this being Cybersecurity Awareness Month, I've gotten a lot of chances to talk this month. And last week, one of the venues I was talking at, I was asked a question about the Equifax and what it meant. And my major takeaway from that was, boy, it's going to be hard, but we've got to end the threat from Social Security numbers. Social Security numbers used as an identity authentication mechanism, something that I have to write down on a piece of paper to actually use. And once I put it on that piece of paper, once it goes into a database, once it's out of my control, it's now a risk to me. Right? My Social Security number and some public information you can Google on the web are enough to steal my identity and open accounts. Right? I know of 4 times in my lifetime, and those are the ones I know of, that my personal Social Security number has been compromised. right? I have yet to change my Social Security number. There is a process. It's painful and onerous and probably going to cause you long-term downstream issues. But anybody here change their Social Security numbers after the Equifax breach? Those of you in government after the OPM breach, right? We don't, right? So the idea that now there's a piece of data out there in bulk that threatens everybody in this room, the idea that anytime I want to use legitimately that Social Security number in a transaction, somebody's asked for it, whether it be my health insurance provider, or the idea if I fill out some government forms that require the Social Security number, they go into paper records, they go into databases, and they are now a lasting and growing threat against me personally. We need a better system, and the technology is there, right, to think about cryptographically strong authentication methods where I can authenticate with a public key but keep my private key private, so I don't have to put it at risk every time I want to authenticate to something. The idea that I can revoke it if there's a known compromise. Now, some people have said, well, can you imagine revoking all of the Social Security numbers in the U.S. after the Equifax breach? No, that would be heinous and untenable. But my point is we shouldn't have to get to that point where everyone is revoked, right? That you've made it secure enough they can have that database with the public key that I have to interact with, and then you, no kidding, put your crown jewel protection around the private key components of your Social Security numbers if they're amassed in bulk, right? So there are ways. As to your question about the NSTIC, that was some exceptional thinking. There are pieces of that absolutely will be carried forward. Again, it comes down to we've had some great thinking. There's a bunch of execution that has to happen. But let nobody walk out of here saying, yeah, 6 months from now we're all going to get some sort of digital replacement for Social Security numbers. This is a long, hard road. There's a lot in that space that has to be thought about. I think that the technology exists, the practical execution is the harder part. There's some decisions between here and there, but what we have decided is we got to look at it, right? Because again, 10 years ago, there was an executive order and some effort that said we're not going to use Social Security numbers for identification, and we're going to limit their use in federal government, and private companies shouldn't be using Social Security numbers. Well, here we are, more than a decade after it was recognized as a problem, and we're still using them. So we've got to take that first step. Every journey starts with that first step. All right, last question.
Yes, thank you. John Holmblad. Do you think that the federal government has any role to play in getting industry to develop more secure software from the get-go versus everything else we're talking about today? And if so, what is that role, do you think? Yeah,
I think the current administration is less about regulation and more about market forces. I think there's value in the federal government making sure that we're publishing best practices. Exceptional work is done at NIST and DHS about the standards we should be using, the types of security flaws that are common out there, the problems that have occurred. Again, my worry is if we regulate and say this is the way you have to do it, what it becomes is a checkbox, adding little real security, and it's a cement line in the sand that we're always drugged back to instead of advancing, because the threats are going to advance and the challenges are going to advance. So our main focus is making sure there's good standards, there's good knowledge out there about what needs to happen, and then really getting the market forces to drive to the point where people who aren't doing security right are called out and remedied, and others see the problems they cause, right? You can bet a whole bunch of people in commercial industry had conversations between their CEO, their CTO, their CISO, and probably their CFO in the wake of Equifax and said, what are you guys doing to make sure we're not that next story? And so that's going to, in the end, drive a lot more practical security today than we ever are going to with paper regulation. Thank you for your time and attention today. I appreciate it.